A young wife's affair with her older boss spirals into obsession, leading to a deadly confrontation and a family's fight for survival. Why did Bethany's boss-turned-lover become so dangerous, and how did it end in murder? Comment below where you're from, and let us know your thoughts on this terrifying true crime case. March 17th, 2003. Pine Hills, Kansas, 11:45 p.m. Inside a small suburban home, Bethany Larson, a 24-year-old wife and mother, sat in silence, her face lit only by the faint glow of her phone screen. She'd been texting for hours, messages full of promises and secrets. Her husband, Ethan, was asleep upstairs, unaware of the messages that Bethany sent late at night. He trusted her completely, which made it easy for her to hide the affair she'd been having for the last 5 months. The man she was texting wasn't just anyone. He was her boss, Daniel Grant. At 48, Daniel was respected in the town, a successful businessman and family man. No one would have suspected anything unusual between him and his young assistant. Bethany and Daniel's relationship had started innocently enough. She joined his company the year before, eager for a job and a new beginning. But over time, he noticed her, complimenting her work, spending extra moments alone in his office, finding ways to make her feel special. For Bethany, who'd felt stuck in her marriage, Daniel's attention filled a void she hadn't realized was there. It wasn't long before a simple text message turned into private meetings, quiet dinners, and eventually something far more dangerous. Bethany knew she was playing with fire. She'd wanted excitement, but this felt different. With Daniel, it was thrilling, like living a life that wasn't hers. But as the affair intensified, Daniel began to push for more. He was growing tired of the secrecy, pressing her to leave Ethan, to be with him fully. But that was never what she'd intended. She loved her family, her life. She just wanted an escape. April 2nd, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 7:30 p.m. Tensions between Daniel and Bethany were rising. That evening, they argued in his office, voices hushed but sharp. She wanted to keep things as they were, private and discreet. Daniel wanted a commitment, and he wasn't willing to be her secret anymore. When Bethany resisted, Daniel became agitated, accusing her of stringing him along, of using him. But Bethany was firm. She couldn't leave her husband. She didn't want to destroy her family. As she left his office that evening, Bethany felt uneasy. She'd seen a side of Daniel she hadn't seen before, a controlling side, something darker. She wondered if she'd made a mistake. Maybe this had gone too far. Maybe it was time to end things. April 5th, 2003, 10:45 p.m. Days passed without contact, and Bethany felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. She missed the thrill, but she also felt the weight of her actions. Then, on a quiet night, she received a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Tomorrow. Meet me at the cabin." The cabin was a place they'd met in secret, miles outside of town. It was quiet, secluded, hidden in the woods where no one would see them. She knew it wasn't safe, but curiosity and a strange sense of loyalty pulled her in. Bethany felt she owed him closure, if nothing else. April 6th, 2003, 8 p.m. When Bethany arrived, Daniel was already waiting, his face pale and his eyes intense. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. The silence between them was tense, each word weighed down by the past few months. Daniel asked her one last time, would she leave her husband? Bethany shook her head, her voice trembling as she told him it was over. In that moment, Daniel snapped. April 7th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 6:15 a.m. The morning after their tense meeting at the cabin, Bethany tried to go about her day as if everything were normal. She got her son ready for school, kissed Ethan goodbye, and drove to work. But inside, her mind was racing. Daniel's expression from the night before lingered in her thoughts. Haunted, desperate, angry. She knew he wouldn't let things end easily. At her desk, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. "You can't just walk away." Bethany felt a chill down her spine. She hadn't blocked him, hadn't thought it would come to this. Over the next few hours, more messages followed. Some pleading, some angry, all filled with the same underlying demand: "Don't leave me." She deleted them one by one, hoping he would tire of this, that he would let her go. But Daniel wasn't just texting, he was watching. April 8th, 2003, 10:30 p.m. That night, Ethan had gone to bed early. Bethany sat alone in the living room, exhausted from the mental strain, trying to figure out what to do next. The room was dark, save for the glow of the TV. Suddenly, she thought she saw something move outside the window, a shadow in the corner of her eye. She froze, heart racing. For a moment, she convinced herself it was nothing, but when she glanced outside, she thought she caught a glimpse of someone standing across the street, half hidden behind a tree. She squinted, leaning closer, and in that split second, she was sure it was Daniel. Bethany pulled the curtains closed, breathing heavily. She couldn't tell Ethan. She'd have to explain everything, and she wasn't ready for that. She'd let it go on too long, and now she was trapped by the very secrets that had once thrilled her. April 10th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 3 p.m. At work, Bethany did her best to avoid Daniel. She kept to herself, answered only when necessary, and tried to stay professional. But Daniel wouldn't be ignored. That afternoon, he cornered her in a deserted hallway, his face intense, eyes dark, with a kind of fury she hadn't seen before. "Why are you doing this to me?" he whispered, his voice laced with desperation. She looked around, terrified someone might overhear, but there was no one. Bethany tried to stay calm, her voice low as she begged him to stop. She told him he was scaring her, that he needed to let her go. But Daniel's expression only grew colder. "You don't get to decide this," he hissed. "You don't just use someone up and throw them away." Bethany felt a knot of fear twisting in her stomach. This was more than an affair gone wrong. This was obsession. And for the first time, she began to wonder just how far Daniel was willing to go. April 12th, 2003, 8 p.m. That night, Daniel left her a voicemail, his voice unnervingly calm. "If you won't end things with Ethan, maybe he should know what's going on." The message was clear. If she didn't come back to him, he'd tell her husband everything. Bethany's world felt like it was spiraling out of control. Her heart pounded as she thought about Ethan finding out, about the damage it would do to their family. The situation was slipping further and further from her control. She had never meant for it to go this far, but the worst was yet to come. April 15th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 9 p.m. Days passed, but Bethany couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She saw Daniel's car parked near their street, caught glimpses of him around town. He was everywhere and nowhere, a presence lurking just outside her reach. On the evening of April 15th, she was at the grocery store, picking up milk and bread, trying to ignore the creeping fear that had become part of her daily life. She thought she'd lost herself in the routine until she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned, and there he was, Daniel, standing too close, a bitter smile on his face. "Why are you doing this to us, Bethany?" he asked quietly, his voice cold and controlled. She backed away, panic rising. He reached for her arm, gripping it tightly. "Don't make me do something we'll both regret." In that moment, Bethany realized there was no reasoning with him. She'd fallen into something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined, and she knew it was only a matter of time before Daniel did something drastic. April 18th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 11 p.m. Bethany lay awake, her mind racing. She tried to ignore Daniel's threats, but his relentless messages, his shadowy appearances, and the warning in his eyes had left her paralyzed with fear. She hadn't told Ethan anything, and that secrecy weighed on her like a brick. She was too scared to confess the affair, too afraid of losing everything. But she knew she couldn't keep living like this. Just as she was drifting off, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The message was from Daniel. "I need to see you. Now." Bethany's pulse quickened. She knew she couldn't meet him, but she was also terrified of what he might do if she ignored him. She typed back, trying to sound calm. "It's late. I can't." Seconds later, another message appeared. "If you don't come, I'll be knocking on your front door." Bethany's heart pounded. She couldn't risk him showing up at her house. Reluctantly, she grabbed her car keys and slipped out of bed, hoping Ethan wouldn't notice. April 18th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 11:30 p.m. Bethany arrived at their usual meeting spot, an abandoned field just outside town. Daniel was waiting, his figure barely visible in the dim light. She could feel the tension in the air as she approached him, her hands shaking. She forced herself to speak calmly, hoping to diffuse the situation. "Daniel, this has to stop," she said, keeping her distance. "I can't keep doing this. I've made my choice and it's over." Daniel's face twisted with anger. "You think you can just walk away after everything I've done for you?" Bethany took a step back, feeling a surge of fear. "I never asked you to do anything. I'm sorry, Daniel, but I have a family. This has to end." But he didn't seem to hear her. He stepped closer, his expression dark and unyielding. "If I can't have you, no one can." Bethany's breath caught in her throat. She realized with sudden clarity just how dangerous he'd become. She turned and sprinted to her car, her heart pounding. She could hear his footsteps behind her, quickening as he chased her. She reached her car just in time, slamming the door and locking it as Daniel pounded on the window, his face twisted in rage. Through the glass he hissed, "You'll regret this, Bethany. I promise you." She drove off, barely able to see through her tears, feeling the weight of his threat settle into her bones. She knew he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, or until something terrible happened. April 20th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 10 a.m. Bethany spent the next few days looking over her shoulder, consumed by anxiety. She tried to act normal around Ethan and their son, but the fear was eating her alive. Every phone call made her jump. Every sound at night kept her awake. She knew she needed help, but telling Ethan felt impossible. She dug herself too deep into this mess. At work, Daniel avoided her in public, but she felt his presence everywhere. She could feel his eyes on her, hear his whispers in the hallways. He was watching her, waiting for her to crack. Finally, after another restless night, Bethany decided to confide in her closest friend, Sarah, who worked at the same office. She told Sarah about the affair, about Daniel's threats, and how afraid she was. Sarah listened quietly, her face a mix of shock and concern. "You have to tell someone, Bethany," Sarah urged. "This isn't safe. You can't let him control you like this." But Bethany shook her head. "I can't. If Ethan finds out, I'll lose everything." Sarah looked at her, a fierce determination in her eyes. "Then at least go to the police. They can help you, protect you." Bethany nodded, but inside, she still felt trapped. She didn't know if she could take that step. It would mean exposing everything, admitting her mistakes. But deep down, she knew Sarah was right. If she didn't do something, Daniel would only keep getting closer. April 22nd, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 2 a.m. That night, Bethany's phone rang again. She hesitated, staring at Daniel's name on the screen, knowing she shouldn't answer. But before she could put it down, the ringing stopped, and a message appeared. "Look outside." Heart pounding, Bethany went to the window, peeking through the blinds. There, standing on the street in front of her house, was Daniel, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't move, just stood there watching her. Bethany backed away, trembling. She had to end this, no matter the cost. April 23rd, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 9 a.m. After a sleepless night, Bethany decided that she couldn't live like this any longer. She was tired of feeling trapped and afraid. She didn't want to lose her family, but the fear of what Daniel might do if she didn't act was even greater. As she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone, she realized her only option was to go to the police. Bethany took a deep breath and called Sarah, who had been her only confidant in all of this. She asked Sarah to meet her after work so they could go to the station together. Sarah agreed without hesitation, assuring Bethany she was doing the right thing. Bethany felt a sense of relief, as though a weight was lifting from her shoulders. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't live with the fear anymore. April 23rd, 2003, Pine Hills Police Station, 6:30 p.m. Bethany and Sarah sat in a small office with Detective Mark Thompson, a middle-aged man with a calm, steady demeanor. Bethany recounted everything from the beginning: the affair, Daniel's threats, and his escalating behavior. Detective Thompson listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes. When she finished, he looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "This isn't the first time we've dealt with situations like this," he said gently. "I know it's hard, but you made the right choice by coming here. We'll issue a restraining order against Mr. Grant, and we'll keep a close eye on things." Bethany nodded, relief flooding her. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe, but a nagging fear remained. She wasn't sure a restraining order would be enough to stop Daniel. As she left the station, Detective Thompson assured her that his team would monitor Daniel's activity and take her concerns seriously. Bethany wanted to believe him, but deep down, she felt uneasy. Daniel wasn't someone who took no lightly. He'd already proven that. April 25th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 8 a.m. News of the restraining order reached Daniel quickly. He had expected Bethany to fold under his pressure, to come back to him. Instead, she'd gone to the police. Furious and feeling betrayed, Daniel's obsession with Bethany only grew stronger. He couldn't believe she had turned on him like this. She was supposed to be his, and now she was making him look like a fool. In his mind, he blamed her for everything. She had led him on, made promises, and then abandoned him. He became fixated on one thought: if he couldn't have her, he would make sure no one else could either. April 27th, 2003, Bethany's home, 11 p.m. Bethany was starting to feel more at ease, as though she had regained some control over her life. She and Ethan were reconnecting, and she was determined to put the past behind her. But that night, her sense of security shattered. Just as she was getting ready for bed, a rock crashed through the living room window. Glass sprayed across the floor, and she froze, too scared to move. Ethan ran into the room, his face pale with shock. "What happened?" he asked, scanning the room. Bethany, barely able to speak, whispered, "I think it's Daniel." They both approached the broken window cautiously, peering out into the darkness. There was no one there, but Bethany knew this was a message. Daniel wasn't finished with her yet. Her hands shook as she held onto Ethan, wondering how long they could keep living like this. April 28th, 2003, Pine Hills Police Station, 9 a.m. Bethany returned to the station the next morning, more shaken than ever. She told Detective Thompson about the broken window, the late-night threats, and her growing fear that Daniel would never let her go. Detective Thompson nodded, his expression grave. "We'll increase patrols around your house," he assured her. "But remember, you need to stay vigilant. If you see him anywhere near you, call us immediately." Bethany thanked him, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over her. She knew Daniel wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted, or until he'd made her pay for rejecting him. May 1st, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 2 a.m. Bethany jolted awake, her heart pounding in the dead of night. She thought she heard footsteps outside the house, soft and deliberate. She strained her ears, hoping it was just her imagination, but the sound grew louder, circling the house slowly, as if someone was surveying every window, every entry point. Her stomach twisted with fear. She nudged Ethan awake, whispering frantically. He listened, hearing it too, his face tense with concern. Without hesitation, he grabbed the phone and called the police. Bethany held her breath, staring out the window into the dark, waiting for the flashing lights, praying they would arrive before anything happened. Minutes later, patrol cars pulled up, their lights casting a reassuring glow. Officers swept the property but found nothing. Whoever had been lurking was gone. But Bethany knew it had to be Daniel, taunting her, pushing her closer to the edge. That night, as she lay awake, her mind raced. She was terrified he'd keep escalating, that he'd eventually break in or, worse, hurt her family. May 3rd, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 9 a.m. Detective Thompson called Bethany to the station. He had a look of frustration as he explained that they couldn't locate Daniel. It was as if he'd vanished. His house was empty, his office deserted, and no one had seen him for days. For the police, this lack of leads made it harder to protect Bethany. She felt her hope fading, replaced by a gnawing fear. "Just be careful," Detective Thompson warned. "If he's avoiding us, it might mean he's planning something." Bethany nodded, her heart sinking. She left the station feeling exposed, as if she was carrying a target on her back. She'd thought the restraining order would help, that the police presence would deter Daniel, but it was clear he was beyond reason. She started looking over her shoulder everywhere she went, her nerves stretched thin. May 5th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 11 p.m. That night, as Bethany was putting her son to bed, her phone buzzed with a new message. The number was unknown, but she knew instantly it was Daniel. "I'm coming for you, Bethany. I've been waiting long enough." Her blood ran cold. She'd lived in fear of this moment, dreading the day he'd make good on his threats. She showed Ethan the message, her hands shaking. He was furious, protective, insisting that they call the police again. But Bethany knew they could only do so much. Daniel had slipped past them every time. They were on their own now. May 6th, 2003, Bethany's home, 3 a.m. Bethany and Ethan barely slept, jumping at every creak, every sound outside. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, a noise shattered the silence, a loud crash at the back of the house. Bethany's heart leapt as she realized someone was trying to break in. Ethan sprang out of bed, grabbing a bat he kept nearby, while Bethany called 911, her voice frantic. She whispered her location, pleading for them to hurry. But as she was on the phone, she heard footsteps inside the house. The intruder was in. She could hear Ethan shouting, his voice filled with anger and fear. She pressed herself against the wall, clinging to her son, hoping they wouldn't be found. She could hear the sound of a struggle, furniture crashing, grunts of pain, and then, just as suddenly, it was silent. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Finally, flashing lights lit up the room. The police burst through the door, rushing to the scene. Bethany's heart pounded as she clutched her son, terrified of what they might find. May 6th, 2003, Bethany's home, 3:20 a.m. When the police reached the living room, they found Ethan standing over Daniel, who lay unconscious on the floor, blood pooling from a cut on his forehead. He had managed to overpower Daniel in the struggle, but Ethan's face was bruised and his hands shook with adrenaline. Bethany rushed to him, relief and fear washing over her. Daniel was alive, but barely, his breathing shallow. The police cuffed him and loaded him into an ambulance, assuring Bethany and Ethan that he would be kept under strict surveillance at the hospital. Detective Thompson arrived soon after, his expression serious. "We've got him now," he promised Bethany. "He won't hurt you again." But even as he spoke the words, Bethany couldn't shake the sense of dread that lingered in the air. Daniel might be in custody, but she knew his obsession wasn't over. She had a feeling he'd never stop trying to get to her, no matter what it took. May 10th, 2003, Pine Hills Police Station, 11 a.m. 4 days after the break-in, Bethany sat across from Detective Thompson, still shaken, but grateful that Daniel was finally in custody. The detective explained that Daniel would be facing charges for breaking and entering, harassment, and assault. The restraining order had already been violated, and with the break-in, the case against him was strong. Bethany listened, relief slowly settling in, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't ignore the feeling that this might not be over. Daniel had been obsessive, relentless, and his threats had been far too real to dismiss. She could still hear his last words in her mind. "I'm coming for you, Bethany." "I've been waiting long enough," Detective Thompson reassured her. "We're keeping him under constant surveillance at the hospital until he's transferred to jail. You're safe now." Bethany nodded, wanting to believe him, but her unease lingered. She left the station feeling like a dark cloud was still hanging over her. May 12th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 8:30 p.m. Back at home, Bethany and Ethan tried to pick up the pieces. They were determined to get back to normal for their son's sake, to put the nightmare behind them. Ethan had been a rock through the entire ordeal, never once faltering in his support for her, even as he pieced together the painful details of the affair she'd been hiding. One evening, as they sat together, Ethan gently asked, "Do you think he'll ever stop? Even with him locked up, do you think we're really safe?" Bethany hesitated, glancing at the clock as if Daniel's shadow could appear at any moment. "I want to believe we are," she replied, "but he's unpredictable. I don't know what he's capable of anymore." Ethan squeezed her hand, his jaw tense. "Then we'll keep fighting, whatever it takes." May 15th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 6 p.m. Just as Bethany was starting to let her guard down, a call from Detective Thompson shattered her fragile sense of security. His voice was grim, laced with an urgency that sent her heart racing. "Bethany, we need you to come down to the station." Fear surged through her as she arrived, her stomach churning. In Thompson's office, he got straight to the point. Daniel escaped. There was an incident during his transfer to the county jail. He attacked a guard and managed to flee. Bethany's hands went cold as his words sank in. "We're doing everything we can to locate him, but I wanted to let you know so you can be extra cautious." Bethany's mind raced with fear and disbelief. Daniel was out there, somewhere, and she knew exactly who he'd be coming for. She felt as though the walls were closing in again, every ounce of safety slipping away. May 16th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 11 p.m. That night, Bethany and Ethan barely slept, the weight of fear heavy in the house. They double-checked every door, every window, and even placed a chair against their bedroom door. The police had stationed patrols outside, but it didn't feel like enough. Bethany knew Daniel well enough to know he wouldn't be easily deterred. He was coming for her. He'd made that clear. As they lay in bed, Bethany whispered, "If he shows up, we need to be ready. We can't take any chances." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "We'll protect ourselves. I won't let him get close to you." But as she was on the phone, she heard footsteps inside the house. The intruder was in. She could hear Ethan shouting, his voice filled with anger and fear. She pressed herself against the wall, clinging to her son, hoping they wouldn't be found. She could hear the sound of a struggle, furniture crashing, grunts of pain, and then, just as suddenly, it was silent. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Finally, Flashing lights lit up the room. The police burst through the door, rushing to the scene. Bethany's heart pounded as she clutched her son, terrified of what they might find. May 6th, 2003, Bethany's home, 3:20 a.m. When the police reached the living room, they found Ethan standing over Daniel, who lay unconscious on the floor, blood pooling from a cut on his forehead. He had managed to overpower Daniel in the struggle, but Ethan's face was bruised and his hands shook with adrenaline. Bethany rushed to him, relief and fear washing over her. Daniel was alive, but barely, his breathing shallow. The police cuffed him and loaded him into an ambulance, assuring Bethany and Ethan that he would be kept under strict surveillance at the hospital. Detective Thompson arrived soon after, his expression serious. "We've got him now," he promised Bethany. "He won't hurt you again." But even as he spoke the words, Bethany couldn't shake the sense of dread that lingered in the air. Daniel might be in custody, but she knew his obsession wasn't over. She had a feeling he'd never stop trying to get to her, no matter what it took. May 10th, 2003, Pine Hills Police Station, 11 a.m. 4 days after the break-in, Bethany sat across from Detective Thompson, still shaken, but grateful that Daniel was finally in custody. The detective explained that Daniel would be facing charges for breaking and entering, harassment and assault. The restraining order had already been violated, and with the break-in, the case against him was strong. Bethany listened, relief slowly settling in, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't ignore the feeling that this might not be over. Daniel had been obsessive, relentless, and his threats had been far too real to dismiss. She could still hear his last words in her mind. "I'm coming for you, Bethany." "I've been waiting long enough," Detective Thompson reassured her. "We're keeping him under constant surveillance at the hospital until he's transferred to jail. You're safe now." Bethany nodded, wanting to believe him, but her unease lingered. She left the station feeling like a dark cloud was still hanging over her. May 12th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 8:30 p.m. Back at home, Bethany and Ethan tried to pick up the pieces. They were determined to get back to normal for their son's sake, to put the nightmare behind them. Ethan had been a rock through the entire ordeal, never once faltering in his support for her, even as he pieced together the painful details of the affair she'd been hiding. One evening, as they sat together, Ethan gently asked, "Do you think he'll ever stop? Even with him locked up, do you think we're really safe?" Bethany hesitated, glancing at the clock as if Daniel's shadow could appear at any moment. "I want to believe we are," she replied. "But he's unpredictable. I don't know what he's capable of anymore." Ethan squeezed her hand, his jaw tense. "Then we'll keep fighting, whatever it takes." May 15th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 6 p.m. Just as Bethany was starting to let her guard down, a call from Detective Thompson shattered her fragile sense of security. His voice was grim, laced with an urgency that sent her heart racing. "Bethany, we need you to come down to the station." Fear surged through her as she arrived, her stomach churning. In Thompson's office, he got straight to the point. Daniel escaped. There was an incident during his transfer to the county jail. He attacked a guard and managed to flee. Bethany's hands went cold as his words sank in. "We're doing everything we can to locate him, but I wanted to let you know so you can be extra cautious." Bethany's mind raced with fear and disbelief. Daniel was out there, somewhere, and she knew exactly who he'd be coming for. She felt as though the walls were closing in again, every ounce of safety slipping away. May 16th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 11 p.m. That night, Bethany and Ethan barely slept, the weight of fear heavy in the house. They double-checked every door, every window, and even placed a chair against their bedroom door. The police had stationed patrols outside, but it didn't feel like enough. Bethany knew Daniel well enough to know he wouldn't be easily deterred. He was coming for her. He'd made that clear. As they lay in bed, Bethany whispered, "If he shows up, we need to be ready. We can't take any chances." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "We'll protect ourselves. I won't let him get close to you." May 17th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 3 a.m. In the dead of night, Bethany awoke to a faint creak from outside their bedroom. Her heart raced as she strained to listen, adrenaline flooding her veins. The chair at their door scraped softly as if someone was pushing it. She reached out, gripping Ethan's arm, and he jolted awake. They barely had time to react before a loud bang echoed through the house. Bethany and Ethan jumped up, fear prickling at their skin. It was him. Daniel was here. Bethany grabbed her phone, dialing 911, as Ethan grabbed the bat he'd kept by the bed since the break-in. She could hear Daniel's voice echoing from the hallway, low and menacing. "Bethany, you can't hide from me." Her hands shook as she whispered her location to the dispatcher. Then, she and Ethan braced themselves, listening to his footsteps approaching the bedroom. They knew that this time, there was no escape. May 17, 2003. Bethany's home, 3:10 a.m. The footsteps grew louder, steady and deliberate. Bethany's heart pounded as she clutched her phone, hearing the dispatcher's calm voice on the other end. "Stay on the line. Officers are on their way," the dispatcher assured her. But she didn't know if they'd make it in time. Ethan stood beside her, his grip tight on the bat, his face tense and determined. Bethany could see the resolve in his eyes. He was ready to do whatever it took to protect their family. Then the bedroom door rattled as Daniel tried to force it open. "Bethany!" he shouted, his voice laced with fury. "You think you can hide from me? You think you're safe?" The door shook again, harder this time, and finally, with a splintering crack, it flew open. Daniel stepped into the room, his face twisted with anger, his eyes wild. He looked almost unrecognizable, a man consumed by obsession and rage. "Daniel, stop!" Bethany shouted, holding up her hands in a desperate attempt to reason with him. "You don't have to do this. Please, just leave." But her words fell on deaf ears. Daniel's eyes were fixed on her, filled with a dark determination. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You made promises, and then you left me. I warned you, Bethany. I warned you this would happen." He took a step closer, but before he could get any closer, Ethan swung the bat, landing a blow on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel stumbled, but he quickly recovered, lunging at Ethan with surprising strength. The two men struggled, grappling with each other as Bethany watched, paralyzed with fear. Ethan fought valiantly, but Daniel's rage made him almost unstoppable. He overpowered Ethan, knocking the bat from his hand and sending him to the ground. Bethany felt a surge of terror as Daniel turned his gaze back to her, his expression filled with cold resolve. "You don't get to leave me, Bethany," he said, taking a step toward her. Bethany backed against the wall, her mind racing, searching for a way out. She could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, a flicker of hope in the darkness. But Daniel wasn't stopping. He raised his hand, poised to strike, when suddenly Ethan tackled him from behind, dragging him to the floor. The two men struggled, each fighting for control, but Ethan managed to pin Daniel down, holding him in place as the sirens grew louder. Within moments, the police burst into the room, guns drawn. "Freeze!" one of the officers shouted. Daniel looked up, realizing he was cornered, his face contorted in fury and defeat. He struggled against Ethan's grip, but it was over. The officers moved in, handcuffing Daniel as Bethany collapsed onto the bed, her body shaking with relief and exhaustion. She could barely process what had just happened, the terror and adrenaline still coursing through her. May 17th, 2003, Pine Hills Police Station, 5 a.m. At the station, Detective Thompson met with Bethany and Ethan, his expression filled with a mix of relief and gravity. "You both did the right thing by calling us. "Daniel won't be able to hurt you anymore." Bethany nodded, still shaken but grateful that it was finally over. Daniel was in custody, his obsession brought to an end. She knew it would take time to recover, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of safety. Detective Thompson assured them that Daniel would face charges for everything he'd done, from harassment to attempted assault. He would be facing a long sentence, with no chance of getting near Bethany again. As the sun began to rise, Bethany and Ethan returned home, exhausted but finally free. They held each other close, knowing that they'd survived a nightmare. And as they watched the dawn break through the darkness, they felt a new beginning ahead, a life where Daniel's shadow would no longer haunt them. May 20th, 2003, Pine Hills Courthouse, 10 a.m. Just days after the harrowing night in their home, Bethany and Ethan sat together in a crowded courtroom. The room buzzed with quiet whispers as friends, family, and townspeople gathered to see justice served. Daniel, now visibly gaunt and sullen, was brought in, his wrists bound, his once intense gaze now hollow and defeated. As the trial began, Detective Thompson presented evidence detailing Daniel's escalating obsession, the numerous violations of the restraining order and the chilling threats he'd made. Witnesses took the stand, including Sarah, who bravely recounted the fear Bethany had confided to her, and Ethan, who spoke with unwavering conviction about the night Daniel broke into their home. Bethany watched Daniel as he listened, his face impassive, but she could feel the faintest hint of anger lingering in his eyes. When it was her turn to testify, Bethany felt a surge of determination. She faced the court and, with a steady voice, described the torment Daniel had inflicted on her and her family. She recounted the relentless texts, the stalking, and the final confrontation in their home. Her words painted a vivid picture of the fear that had gripped her for months and the relief she now felt, knowing he would never come near her again. The jury deliberated for only an hour before returning with a verdict, guilty on all charges. Daniel's sentence was long and unyielding, with no chance of early release. Bethany felt a wave of relief as she heard the words, knowing the justice system had closed this chapter of her life. June 3rd, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 8 p.m. In the weeks following the trial, Bethany and Ethan took slow, steady steps toward rebuilding their lives. They focused on their son, each other, and the quiet moments they had once taken for granted. The lingering sense of fear faded, replaced by a newfound strength born from everything they had endured together. One evening, as they watched their son play in the backyard, Ethan turned to her, his expression soft. "We made it through," he said. "You're free now." Bethany nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "I am," she whispered, "and I'm so grateful." They held each other, the weight of the past slowly lifting, replaced by hope for a brighter future. June 15th, 2003, Pine Hills Police Station, 9 a.m. Detective Thompson was wrapping up paperwork related to the case when he received an unexpected phone call from the warden at the state prison. "I wanted to inform you," the warden said, his tone heavy. "Daniel Grant was killed last night in an altercation with another inmate." Thompson paused, the news settling in. He felt no satisfaction, only a strange sense of finality. Daniel's obsession had brought him to a dark end, a life wasted in the grip of a twisted fixation. June 16th, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 10 a.m. Detective Thompson paid Bethany and Ethan a visit to inform them of Daniel's death. As he sat with them, he explained what had happened, choosing his words carefully. He wanted them to know that the threat was gone forever, but he approached the subject with sensitivity. Bethany listened quietly, feeling an odd mix of relief and sadness. She had never wanted this outcome, yet she couldn't deny the overwhelming sense of peace that came with the finality of it all. She looked at Ethan, seeing the same emotions reflected in his eyes, a shared understanding that this chapter had truly closed. They thanked Detective Thompson for everything he'd done, knowing they would never have found peace without his help and support. June 21st, 2003, Pine Hills, Kansas, 6 p.m. Bethany and Ethan held a small gathering with close friends and family, celebrating the resilience that had brought them through the storm. It was a quiet evening, filled with laughter and warmth, a stark contrast to the dark days they had endured. As the sun set, Bethany took a moment alone, standing under the fading light, feeling the weight of her past finally lift away. She looked around at the people she loved, her heart filled with gratitude for the strength that had carried her through. From that night on, Bethany and her family moved forward, forever changed, but stronger than ever. The darkness of the past had finally given way to a new beginning, and she embraced it fully, knowing she would never allow fear to rule her life again.